Hello friends and comrades, and welcome back to another video on the MCP channel. The war in Ukraine has not just begun. It is a conflict that has been ongoing for 8 years. In the most blatant coup in history, in 2014, a color revolution occurred, whereby a puppet government was installed with US support. Here the goal is simply to try to reverse that. Putin is going to remove US meddling in Ukraine. Under the puppet government, Ukraine has waged war against its very own population in the east, who did not accept the regime change. Ukraine is forcing cultural assimilation of the Russian ethnic population of the country, by banning the Russian language in schools, for example, and to think Westoids whine about cultural genocide in Xinjiang. Ukraine outlawed the Communist Party of Ukraine in 2015. So what Russia is doing now is in no way at all worse for the working class than what the Kievan government has been doing since 2014. It is extremely ironic that the West is happy when separatists in Taiwan try to break from the socialist PRC, but Donetsk and Lugansk trying to break away from a fascist state is illegitimate and must be stopped with the full force of NATO. The Russian government waited 8 years to recognize the independence of the republics and tried everything to solve the situation through diplomacy and really did seem to be hoping to avoid a war. Russia will gain nothing economically from defending the republics. This is ultimately the result of long-term imperial aggression against Russia. With Ukraine getting ever closer to joining NATO, it is plain to see why Putin is anxious. In the West, it is reported that Russia just did this for no reason or out of aggression or imperialism. And the fact is conveniently excluded that NATO repeatedly broke their promises to Russia over the last 30 years, that there would be no extension of NATO's jurisdictions for forces of NATO 1 inch to the east. Putin and Biden literally had months of peace talks before this, wherein Putin specifically asked for Ukraine not to join NATO and to cease military activity in the region, to which Biden refused repeatedly. So diplomatic solutions indeed have been tried and both parties refuse to compromise. But America has let it come to this. Given NATO's behavior, this is the only thing Russia can do now to prevent medium-range ballistic missiles being on its doorstep. Quite simply, it is not possible to freely allow Ukraine to shell civilians. These events really are the least of what Ukraine had coming to them. Ukraine will certainly remain its own nation. It's just Russia is not allowing them to have a military when they operate in such ludicrous manner by attacking Donetsk. Ukraine will still be Ukraine. It's not going to be a greater Russia in some annexation. But they have simply proven to misbehave with their forces, and so this is their resulting punishment. It is questionable as whether this should be termed an invasion, since Russia is not taking anything. Putin claims this is a denazification and demilitarization operation, and that none of the country will be occupied by Russia. So far, the entire Ukrainian military has been disabled by precision attacks, without attacking civilians. So we will just have to wait and see what happens next. Regarding the conduct of the fighting itself, Russia is targeting military command centers and infrastructure with their bombs. The war is not being fought against civilian populations. Perhaps we are all just so used to the American way of waging war, we forgot it is possible to actually just not bomb civilian targets. It is completely possible to have a war with minimal civilian suffering. For example, the American Civil War, where only 10 to 20% of the deaths were civilians. There are also many false or deceptive reports meant to give the impression of an attack on civilian population even if they don't exactly say it outright. For example, it was reported Kiev was being bombed, but as it turned out they were in fact bombing military airports that stationed fighting jetters an hour outside the city. The media wanted to give the sense that civilians are being attacked in a full-scale invasion, including in the capital, but now even the BBC Ukraine itself is reporting up to 10 civilians have been killed, whereas more than 40 Ukrainian soldiers were killed and hundreds of military targets destroyed, which in terms of warfare is pretty constrained and targeted. War is never good, but this is simply nowhere near the mass slaughter of civilians that Western nations have done. How about we contrast this to the wars of the West? We don't see any targeted drone strikes on civilian weddings, for example. Why don't we mention the fact that US and Somalia since 2003 drone striking it since Obama, or that Syrian capital was just bombed by Israel? I doubt it would be the making of the BBC. The Russian army is leaving civilians untouched, and there is no resistance, neither from the population nor from most of the army, curiously. This is not a conventional war. Again, there is no resistance, and the Ukrainian army seems to have mostly given up. Sumy and the surrounding towns have been completely taken without resistance and without civilian deaths. I feel that this will likely play out similarly to the Crimean situation. The army there has no reason to fight and die for this country if it can easily just desert to the Russian side and get a higher salary and be finally free from those Nazis. Why is the situation being portrayed so dishonestly then? It is in order to manufacture consent. Russian strikes are not targeting civilians. Western news are updating this story every minute, making it out like it's World War III, and reporting non-stop. All of us, they don't even care when Israel bombs Syria, the US bombs Somalia, and let's not talk about the Yemen war. The gears of paranoia have certainly activated, and the Russian bad switch has been flipped in the minds of NPCs. And this is the terrifying part of manufacturing consent. People will begin to fabricate their own stories based purely off this sentiment. People are so propagandized, they will generate their own false narratives. The populists already demonized Russia due to the tone of MSM, and so invent narratives of things never happening, like missile strikes on civilians, just like they do for China and Xinjiang. People say things like, there is an egomaniac ordering missile strikes on civilians. No wonder manufacturing consent is so easy. These people make this up all on their own without even being told anything. You see people now freaking out and the World War III breaking out, seemingly under some impression that Russia wants to annex/occupy Ukraine completely and just nuke everyone for unspecified reasons. Now, we are not necessarily claiming that Russia's intent here is only to remove any Ukrainian military presence from DPR, LPR. That was certainly the start. But Putin wants to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine as a whole. He made it clear that he wants to remove the pro-NATO puppet government. That's why Russian Corps is heading to Kiev. They captured an airbase a few kilometers outside of Kiev. They may very well try and take the capital at this point. It isn't mere interference in Donbass. We support this operation, but we shouldn't downplay what's happening as just Donbass stuff. Otherwise, we will be attacked. So, what will happen next? We don't know for sure. Maybe actually free elections. Hopefully with the participation of the Communist Party, which was banned in 2015 by the Fascists. Maybe a scenario where every region will get to express its will as whether to join Russia or stay independent in a situation like Crimea's 2014 referendum. NATO have had this coming for a long time. Russia was never truly accepted into the Western order even after they turned capitalist in 1991. The country and people were essentially exploited, its wealth stolen and its dignity robbed. This was more of a cultural and ethnic prejudice against the East, with the anti-communism being a mask for racism and imperialism in disguise. The continued hostility against even capitalist Russia just shows that it wasn't actually ideology that made the West against Russia, but the possibility of a non-Western nation becoming strong. It's the exact same thing for China too, by the way. The US empire won't accept anything but total submission. And still, even after Russia abandoned socialism for them, they are still antagonizing the country. Now, Putin is more or less without any other option than opposing NATO and imperialism forcefully just to survive. In summary, Ukraine has been banning the Russian language and massacring their ethnic Russians for 8 years straight. Diplomacy was pretty much exhausted, let's be honest, and violence further east does genuinely seem to be aimed at destroying Ukrainian military capabilities. Russia is not socialist, but it supports a lot of socialist nations against US aggression, such as Cuba, Syria, China, and so on. From a communist point of view, Ukraine under Russian control is better than being under NATO-supported neo-Nazis that outlawed the Communist Party. At least in Russia, the Communist Party is allowed to exist, and is actually the second party at every election. This, then, is the beginning of peace for the people in the eastern region of Ukraine, who were under constant military attacks from Western-installed and funded Nazi Azov battalion military for almost a decade. Finally, the military facilities where those attacks originated from have been neutralized. No more schools shall be bombed. No more teachers shall be killed. It's pretty clear to our party what's the better option for the working class. Thank you kindly for your attention, comrades.
Geopolitical.